when does the irreal become real? So he pretty much knew what was happening and made some really fantastic predictions, and said, and asked the question why, in fact, everybody got it wrong, except for Michael Moore. Why did all the pundits get it wrong? And he said Michael Moore did something, maybe without realizing it, that the pundits didn't do. They took polls when in fact they should have used a particular method, which he talks about here, a scientific method, that would have given them very accurate results. When that scientific method was utilized by Michael Moore, which was simply interview the people, make them feel at home, they'll tell you everything. But if you just poll them, they'll tell you what they think you want to hear. And so there's a bias that's potential there. But when you treat them as human beings, they're happy to tell you, yeah, well, this is my reason. I'm going to vote for Trump. Well, end of story. Okay, so he goes into that, and then he explains a number of factors that we've been talking about in the last couple of days and been writing about in Psyche and etc. We also have a section in there for early career professionals and for students, because the fact of the matter is, I'm in my mid-70s, and I ain't getting younger, and ultimately, this is going to be a profession, if it survives, for the young. And so we damn well better cater to the young. We better enlist them in this enterprise, otherwise this enterprise won't exist. And I'm very much in love with psychoanalysis, almost as much as I love my wife. So I hope that it will continue long after I'm gone.
I showed up today.
We have another one, another article which I think is a good article, and I hope to stimulate more articles from this sector, from a young man who's from China. And the Chinese have embraced psychoanalysis. They love it, including the Chinese at the head of the party. For some strange reason, it slips through the censor. Now, maybe because the early history of psychoanalysis was marked by its relationship and fondness for Marxism. Erich Fromm was a very strong Marxist, and for that reason probably got lambasted by Americans in this country, and then ultimately left William Allison White, that he helped found, and wound up going to Mexico. So the history of psychoanalysis is replete with all sorts of, internal strife and sexy, little gossip, tidbits that I love to hear. When you attend class, you learn the theory, you learn the practice, you learn the techniques. Maybe you learn a little bit about, some history. But ultimately, the things that fascinated me most were the stories behind the stories. What was Ferenczi really like as a person? What was Freud all about? Because then you understand, for me, the theory better. So in that instance, by knowing the personal background of Freud, I could understand why he came to the Oedipal issue and was led away from, or maybe didn't even consider, sibling rivalry, pre-Oedipal themes like that, or even pre-symbolic themes that he totally avoided. All right, so let me start now with the paper, officially. I'm now on the clock. The title of the paper is, and here's what it looks like. Up front and close, or not so close, but certainly not ripped. And for those of you who are colorblind, the title of the paper is Creating a Journal That Makes Meaning of the Misunderstood Mentations of the Mad, Scared, and Sad. JASPER. Ultimately, you have to raise a bunch of questions. How do we know that what we say we do in psychoanalysis is really what we in fact do? Or is it simply do-do? Well, one of the claims the counterclaims that's been made against us is that we have no evidence to support what we do. Well, as you'll see in a moment, that's absolutely false. But it still raises a very important question, which is, how do we know that what we claim to do in the consulting room is really effective, much less helpful? Well, I saw the patient get better. The patient came in was psychotic. He's no longer psychotic. And guess what the common refrain is, the retort to that commonly by non-psychoanalysts is, can you guess? He wasn't psychotic.
He wasn't really psychotic.
Yeah, you over-diagnosed him. Nonsense. And in fact, that's difficult to refute, because one of the problems with diagnosis is, in England, we call somebody bipolar. In this country, we call them schizophrenic. And which is true. I don't know. So we need to have some semblance of ability to narrow these things down. And we need to be able to do research on it. And that's ultimately it. Now, we do have research. We've had research right from the start. And I'll get into that in a second. So, although it must seem counterintuitive to found yet another psychoanalytic journal in what seems like a proliferation of such publications over the last 3 decades, and the pressure to increase readership levels and quality submissions, JASPER promises to be different. It's unique by virtue of the fact that a journal like this does not currently exist, which is amazing. I waited year after year. 40 years ago, I noticed that there was an absence of a research journal in psychoanalysis that was strictly dedicated to research. And I said to myself, gee, that's a void that needs to be filled. But I never thought I would be the one to fill it. Then I thought, well, nobody's filling it. So a decade went by, nobody filled it. I said, there are a lot of smart people out there, smarter than me. There must be a reason why they didn't fill this gap. I can't possibly do this. And then another decade went by, and still nobody did it. And I said to myself, what's going on here? And then a couple of minor research journals came out, and they failed. Again, I said to myself, this is ridiculous. Why doesn't psychoanalysis have a journal strictly devoted to research? Everybody's claiming we don't have evidence-based research. We don't have empirical research. Well, the fact of the matter, we do. In fact, one of the problems is our research is spread so far and wide over so many journals that nobody, without an unlimited expense account, can possibly read all of these journals. I read as many journals as I possibly can. I'm a research nerd, and yet I still can't keep up with all the things that are out there. It's just impossible, and more journals are coming out as we speak. So why do we need another one? Because this one doesn't exist, that's number one. And number two, the most important thing is that we need to show that we can back up what we're saying. Okay, so this journal will be strictly dedicated to collecting, reviewing, promoting, and publishing scholarly, yet readable, scientific, psychoanalytic, empirical research gathered from diverse sources intended for a wide audience. Had I tried to publish these things 40 years ago when I first did it, when I first conceived of it, it probably wouldn't have worked. For one thing, I wasn't as skilled back then. I've learned a heck of a lot over these years, just through osmosis, and mostly through really paying assiduous attention. So it probably would have gone the way of a lot of other journals. That is, it would have been unsuccessful, would have flopped, simply because of inhospitable timing. But now, with the exigencies and realities of shrinking dollars allocated to pay for mental health treatment, combined with the demands of managed care, pressure from governmental agencies, big pharma, and insurance companies, now I believe that psychoanalysis may have no choice but to make its case more stridently, that psychoanalysis has a valid set of theories and is an effective, viable form of treatment. This time around, from my sampling of a lot of people over the years, the conditions, as well as this journal's approach, may be more favorable for a positive outcome. However, it will require a full appreciation and recognition on the part of the psychoanalytic community that we can delay no longer and that there are compelling reasons for us to embrace the necessity of this endeavor. And in this way, ultimately, take some pleasure in the eventual benefits to be derived from giving birth to and nurturing our baby Jasper. But this begs the question, as I was alluding to a moment ago, why does psychoanalysis need a journal of this kind at all? Well, the secondary answer that I gave earlier is that a journal currently of this type doesn't exist. But the primary answer goes to the heart of the matter, which is, one, to demonstrate that psychoanalysis as a theory has or does not have validity. I will publish articles that show it doesn't work. Now, most people don't want to come up with a negative result, but that would be encouraged. That's a good thing, because it saves future researchers time, energy, and money. When they discover it's been tried, don't do that. Move on to a different, way of approaching it. It does or does not have validity with particular regard to the existence of the unconscious, transference, countertransference, resistance, dream work, free association, attachment, separation, individuation, castration anxiety, which, by the way, can be measured, interestingly enough, and a number of other psychoanalytic hypothetical constructs. Ask me about that later, by the way. Two, that psychoanalytic practice has or has not demonstrable efficacy. And three, to respond to the naysayers who claim that psychoanalysis has no research to back up its claims, and that even if it did, such claims are either not testable or measurable. That is, they are not falsifiable. The so-called Popper admonition. Nothing could be further from the truth. Over 120 years ago, actually 122 exactly, Freud in 1895 proposed a project for a scientific psychology. Although he veered off from bringing Although he veered off from bringing his psychological phenomena into the laboratory to be studied scientifically in terms of neurobiochemistry, in favor of his by now famous clinical case studies, he never entirely gave up his bold plans for making psychoanalysis into a hard science. That is, one which could study the mind or the psyche in terms of pure energy. A clear indication of Freud's beliefs is found in his introductory statement of the scientific project. Quote, "The intention is to furnish a psychology that shall be a natural science, that is, to represent psychical processes as quantitatively determinate states of specifiable material particles," unquote. He's dead serious about this. Now, Freud drew upon what was known at the time as an amalgamation of the metapsychological in which the hydraulic, energetic, structural, electrical, and mechanistic were the central constituent ingredients. In keeping with the research investigations of his day, he was interested in studying matter, mass, quantity, conservation of energy, cause and effect, reason, consciousness, and the nature of the unconscious. Sadly, he was limited by the size of his sample as well as his methodologies. We've come a long way since Freud. We have good ways that are creative of defining things operationally and measuring them. For the most part, his methods centered on being able to make accurate observations by employing even hovering attention, in which he noted the free association of his patients as well as Freud's own associations. Freud's concept of resistance in therapy is an interesting concept. My father was an electrician, and I worked on construction as an electrician in order to put my way through college. And so this was a near and dear concept to me. Freud's concept of resistance in therapy was similar in many respects to mechanisms in physics that had to do with anything that slows down or interferes with the transmission of a current through an electrical cord. That's called impedance. By comparing physical resistance to processes in psychoanalysis, Freud hoped that just as impedance could be measured, so could emotional resistances that occur in psychoanalysis be quantified one day. If his vision was a little bit premature in terms of what was known for his day and age and the methods that were at his disposal for studying the phenomena that we call the mind, his wish to advance psychoanalysis as a science, even if we disagree with its reductionistic, mechanistic emphasis, was certainly prescient. He also correctly anticipated that there would be barbarians at the gate who would attack psychoanalytic thinking at practically every twist and turn. While Freud used free association, which is a scientific method, a method of observing something, Jung developed word association. Jung astutely observed that individuals took longer amounts of time to respond to certain words as opposed to other words that seemed to have less of an emotional charge or pull. That's measurable. He named these responses latency phenomena, response latency phenomena. He named them complexes. In fact, these complexes, that is, delays in response time, are measurable, as I said. In these simple two approaches, free association and word association, we see the very first attempts to quantify what goes on in the interior of an individual. But others from the ranks of psychoanalysis would also produce significant empirical data. The work of René Spitz back in 1944 and 45 on hospitalism and infantile marasmus, Bowlby's studies of attachment, Mahler's research and film documentation of separation and individuation issues, all the way up to the current day of Beatrice Beebe's studies involving the connection between a mother and a child. Brilliant studies, simple studies. Does everybody know what Beatrice Beebe's studies are? Is there somebody who does not? I'm happy to go into it. Okay, let me go into it very briefly. Beatrice Beebe devised a beautiful technique using cameras that weren't available back then, even to Mahler, of split-screen photography, in which she looks at the mother's face and the baby's face simultaneously looking at each other. It's wonderful. The baby is approximately 3 to 4 or 5 months of age in each case. And in this particular instance, she has a series of mothers who are a little on the depressed side. And so they tend to specialize in looking for and finding rejection at every twist and turn. And so the mother leans in and smiles at the baby, and the baby moves back. The mother's hurt. So she moves in further. The baby leans back further. Now the mother's in for the kill. She's right in the baby's face. The baby arches its back and moves back further. Now, a baby arching its back is a little painful. So that says something is going on that's impinging on the baby, that's painful. The mother assumes it's her. She's a terrible mother. Beatrice Beebe shows the film to the mother and says, let's slow down the photography and watch it step by step, cell by cell. And you'll discover that if you hold your grin and don't move in, the baby will come back. The reason the baby's moving away, says Beebe, correctly, as it turns out, is that there's too much stimuli. So the baby's just trying to regulate it in the only way it knows how. Just goes down, move away. But the baby will return as soon as it discovers that There's not too much. And the baby does return, and the mother feels terrific. Look at this, and I have a great relationship with the baby. And she does this countless times with mothers who are having that difficulty. That's a good study. It's an observational study. You can't put numbers to it, although Stern did mention in some of his papers that there's an optimal distance between the mother and the baby. If you're too far away, it produces feelings of depression in the baby as the baby grows up. And if you're too close, the baby shuts down or short circuits, and it produces schizophrenia. Exactly what Mahler had predicted decades earlier. In terms of an overload, the baby has to close down, dissociate or close down. Psychoanalysis has a spate of research to back up its claims. The problem is, we haven't demonstrated that adequately to the rest of the world. And so I developed the idea that we have it under one roof, under one house, so that you can find all the research in one place, rather than search for it in lots of different journals. Even with PepWeb and Google, there are some articles that don't appear, don't show up. I wrote an article on diagnoses as a form of name calling. Don't kill me. Because I think at times it's been used incorrectly. And I wrote it in a journal in Great Britain. And I looked it up. I couldn't find it. Now I know this, I know the reference. I wrote the article. I can't find the darn thing. It's located deep in cyberspace somewhere. Ultimately, if you stick with it long enough, you'll find it. So there are some things that can't be found easily. But this will be found. And the funny part about it is, JASPER1.org is #1 on the list. You know, they have hit lists. For some reason, nobody's else done it. So therefore, it appears first. So there's some benefit as well that I hadn't anticipated. Okay, I'm going to get pretty much to the point. If I flash forward to the current research, which I just did with respect to Beatrice, in between that past and now, there are tons of research from Luborsky, from Spence, from Barber. Jacques Barber is from, he was at the University of Pennsylvania at one time as the head of the department, and now he's the dean of the Gordon Derner Center at Delphi. He's a researcher. We almost recently collaborated on a panel that we're about to hold in. We're going to Prague to talk about JASPER as well. He had to back out at the last moment, unfortunately. But he's produced tons of research. But it's in this journal, and that journal, and every journal. And so even I, who know the research, can't find it in all the journals. So we need one place, one particular place. Now, one of the problems with psychoanalysis in the present day, and it's a very practical problem, is that non-psychopharmacological studies are few and far between, simply because they don't get funded. And so there are more pharmacological journals than there are psychoanalytic journals, and there are more pharmacological research that promote everything under the sun involving medication and other forms of therapy to the exclusion of psychoanalysis. So what they say is, in each and every case, in addition to medication, the appropriate therapy that should be used is CBT. They say it consistently. It's a formula. No mention is made of psychoanalysis. If I were a stranger coming from another planet, and I would read this, I would think, oh my goodness, psychoanalysis. I wouldn't even know about psychoanalysis. I would think CBT is the preferred thing, it must be the best. And they tout it as the best. But the fact of the matter is, according to people like Shedler, Jonathan Shedler out of the University of Colorado, psychoanalysis actually lasts longer than than CBT or any other psychotherapy. And when CBT or those other therapies do work at all, they work largely, according to Schedler, because they produce results. The methodology that they have is right out of psychoanalysis, only they don't give credit for it. And this is quite common. You don't cite it, so nobody knows about it. But that's a subtle form of plagiarism in a way. But they claim it as though they themselves came up with it because they have different terminology. But the fact of the matter is simply saying to somebody, don't think those thoughts, or stop that obsessive doubt of yours, doesn't work. The person, if they get any kind of positive result from it whatsoever, it's because they had a relationship with the therapist. That's what it comes down to. Well, we've been talking about that for a long time. Ferenczi was the first to note it. Freud talked about empathy. Cohen specialized in empathy. He explained it in great depth, but Freud was the first to talk about it. Ferenczi made an art of it, but even art can be studied scientifically. How do we know one piece of supposedly art that was supposedly drawn by Van Gogh really is a Van Gogh, not a fake? How do you know? Well, you have to develop scientific methodology to study it. Use electron microscopes and things like that. Now, we're not that advanced in psychoanalysis that we have those kinds of tools, but we do have tools. We have lots of tools. If I want to know the meaning of a particular person's word usage, I ask the person, what do you mean by that? And they tell me, they give me their free associations. But there's another way to measure it, using the semantic differential. The semantic differential, developed by Osgood in 1961, where you can actually measure words along a bipolar continuum, from active, passive, strong, weak, etc. You can measure a concept and see where it falls along there. I mean, it's not the perfect method, but it gives you an idea of how to narrow down meaning and things of that nature. So if we could do that with meaning and meanings of words, certainly we could do it with other things, but we have to be creative about it. But if we start out with the premise that a lot of psychoanalysts have, that psychoanalysis isn't strictly an art, then there's no point in looking at anything. But the problem with that is, even if it is an art, and with certain people in certain hands, it is, certainly with Ferenczi, no question about it, you have to be able to explain how you did it and how it can be done again. It's the reason why Ferenczi kept detailed notes that we recently discovered and translated in his clinical diaries, because he was trying to explain what happened. Now, the gold standard that's been listed thus far in research is the so-called double-blind randomized trial. It's not the gold standard. That's a premise. That's an assumption that hasn't been tested. The fact of the matter is it's not the gold standard. It's a good standard, but it doesn't talk to all aspects of research. The gold standard that nobody mentions is actually a longitudinal study. Something goes from here to here to here to here, and you see change. Oh my goodness, there's this change. Well, we have some identical twins, only this kid was treated and this kid wasn't. And we do have some studies on that, interestingly. And this kid grew from here to here, and this other one didn't so much. This one went with psychoanalysis. I'll give you another study, really cool study. You'll love this. This has to do with suicide. The highest rates of suicide among professionals occur in the following three occupations. 5 minutes, I will get it done. The three following occupations are, in no order of importance, they're closely tied. Anesthesiologists, dentists, and therapists. Three highest rates of suicide. Now, let me give you one of the lowest rates of suicide. Therapists. Wait a minute, didn't you say therapists won the highest? Yeah, I said that. Wait a minute, so how could that be? The highest and they're the lowest. Well, Well, those that have been in their own therapy are in the lowest. That says something about how good therapy is. Therapy is important. It works. But those are the things that we want to talk about here. I want to talk about, I don't want to just talk about dull stuff. Anybody can write a paper about dull stuff, that's done all the time, and you can crank out research here and there. But JASPER wants to be a different kind of journal, one that's not a stodgy old journal that your mother-in-law and your father-in-law and your relatives from another era, including my era, are concerned with. I want it to be a lively, kind of journal because research is fun. You talk about sexy research, it's fun. Now, some research is juicy, but not fun. Juicy, for example, studies of violence. I want to see studies of violence. I want to know why people do the things they do. I also want to know studies of resilience, why people don't do those things, or how they survive them. Why is it 70% of people who were abusers, who were abused, don't become abusers? 30% do, which is high. But 70% don't. How come? I want to see stuff like that. That tells me information that's vital. All right. The unfortunate part about all this is that people in high places have mischaracterized psychoanalysis. One of those is Eric Kandel. I like Eric Kandel. He's a nice guy. He's warm and fatherly, but he doesn't know anything other than his specialty. He knows a lot about his specialty. But his specialty is like tiny little planaria or some little animal species. And he's good, and he won a Nobel Prize for it. But he then jumps all the way over to psychoanalysis and says, well, there's no research that supports psychoanalysis. Excuse me, sir. We'll show you research. Tons of it, right from the beginning. But because he said it, nobody questions it. And that's sad, including other analysts who don't believe, they're my friends, who don't believe that we really can study what we do. And that's a shame. So I'm passionate about that. I'm angry about that. Okay. Strangely enough, even though most departments are closing down with respect to teaching psychoanalysis and stuff like that, students want to know more about it. They want to know more than just consciousness. They want to know what's going on inside. What happens in my dreams? How come I'm having them? Why do I feel this way? Why do I act this way? How come? I, for one, for a long time was extremely self-destructive. If there was an important test that I had to take, you could guarantee I'll fail it. I'll find ingenious ways to screw it up, including if it was a test about everything I knew under the sun, like my name. I'll mess it up. I'll miss a page, I didn't see it, gone. And so I went into analysis to try and figure out what's going on here. Why do I need to castrate myself? I didn't use those terms in those days, but ultimately that's what it comes down to. And in my own analysis, I discovered my relationship with my father was very difficult. My father dropped out of school in the 8th grade. Both of his parents died in the pandemic Spanish flu that swept across the world right after World War II. And in the 8th grade, he dropped out of school to support 5 brothers and sisters. I got to the 8th grade. Up until that time, I'm a very good student. Paid attention, things came easy to me. And suddenly, I'm messing up 8th grade. How do you mess up 8th grade? I found ways. And in analysis, I figured out what was going on and how that happened, and it plagued me. Now, I'm not afraid of exams anymore. I'm not afraid of too much anymore. I get nervous. I'm up here. I'm scared. There's no question about that. But I'll face you guys, and I'll do what I have to do to prepare for it. And so, as long as I do that, I know things are okay. So, I want this journal to be here not as a testimonial to my great ego or because I overcame so much in my life. I'm not that important. I thought a lot of people could do this well before me. I thought they would. And the problem was, since nobody did, I thought, oh my goodness, it's got to be done. Who should do this? If not me, then who? So I jumped into the fray, and here I am. And we actually are going to get this darn thing out. This is the mock-up, and it's I'm proud of it. I think it's going to be a good thing. So I hope you think so too. Let me conclude here. All right. This journal will focus on research and papers that are qualitative along with those that are quantitative. Along with this, there will be a place for carefully conducted individual case studies in which treatment methods are clearly spelled out, step by step, and there is a specific description of the beginning, middle, and end. In other words, such studies should delineate each step of the process from start to finish so that the reader is clear what is being investigated, how the research is being conducted, and what the results really are. Where before some psychoanalysts were squeamish about doing empirical research because it was supposed that our theoretical constructs, attunement, and intuitive responses to patients were more art forms than scientific phenomena, and these practices could not be defined, much less measured, there is now a recognition that even art can be described and discussed. Admittedly, all aspects of art may not be measurable at this time, or perhaps ever, but many facets of our practices can be narrowed down, operationally defined, and quantified. At this point, the reality is there may be no other choice. The imposition of external pressures brought to bear by insurance companies, psychopharmacology companies, and other competing forms of psychotherapy now demand that we accept the challenge to produce evidence to support our very existence and viability as a unified, although diverse school of thought and mode of operations. Finally, fortunately, psychoanalysis since its inception has had a scientific bent. So this is not an ego-alien idea. Although many in our ranks do not consider themselves to be researchers, they do not speak for those of us who are able to live in both worlds, clinical practice and research. Lately, even non-researchers among us are expressing interest in the work of those stalwart souls who have been or are currently producing salutary results supportive of the psychoanalytic enterprise. Finally, we welcome collaboration with other like-minded organizations that believe that psychoanalysis should and can be studied and wish to join us at JASPER to bring this concept into fruition and make this plan for a psychoanalytic journal of empirical research into a reality. Thank you all very much.